The first thing we want to do, no matter what methods class we're in, is be sure that we know exactly where to find our standards, because that determines what we are legally responsible for teaching a student that we have been given control of. So if they're on our roster for 7th grade math, then we are responsible for making sure that they are taught 7th grade math standards. Okay. Now, most of us who've been in education a while know that standards are the specific skills, knowledge, and processes that we expect students to leave a grade level with. Okay, so I began this on the education.ky.gov, which is the Kentucky Department of Education website. And in order to navigate to my standards, I'm going to select the standards content areas here. And then I can choose Explore Your Standards. Okay. And I'm going to choose, in our case, Kentucky Academic Standards for Mathematics. Notice that there are additional standards here, but these are the ones that we're going to focus on. Now, the standards document is 260 pages long. The majority of people do not print this thing, mostly because this is math standards from anyone starting in kindergarten and going all the way up through 12th grade. Okay. Now, what's really interesting about this particular document is it's not just a list of standards. It also has a background. Why did we revise these standards? Why are they Kentucky's revised standards? What was the purpose behind that? How did they develop these? Who was part of that development? The legal ability that they had to change this. What laws made the change possible? So there's just a lot of historical information here about the process behind creation of these standards. What we want to go down here and look at is standards use and development. Okay, it's important that we always remember, and this is something that was frequently forgotten when we were using Common Core standards, is that standards are just that. They're standards, they're not curriculum. They tell you what your students should be able to do. They do not tell you how you have to teach that skill. So, for example, a standard might say a student needs to be able to subtract within 3-digit subtraction and regrouping. That doesn't mean that they're saying you have to use base 10 blocks to teach it, or you have to use any other manipulative, or you might have to use Saxon math. They don't make any of those determinations. It's just this is what they need to know. It's entirely up to you in how you teach that and how you meet the needs of each student. Okay. Now, we don't have to create a curriculum guide and submit that to the State Department. However, most districts will have a pacing guide, which pretty much takes the standards for a particular grade level and determines in what order they're going to cover those standards. Reason behind that thinking usually is if students are transient, which means they switch back and forth between schools, then if they've left one school in Scott County and go to another school in Scott County, the pathway through learning is going to be pretty similar. So they're not going to come into a math class where they are perhaps learning something they've already been taught, or they've missed learning a topic through the transition. Okay, most districts will create that amongst themselves. It's called a pacing guide. Okay, in terms of anything in additional to that, most districts do have particular elements they want to see in your curriculum, but may not be any more specific than that. Okay, so how are these organized? They're organized in what we call vertical alignment. Vertical alignment just means connecting one grade level to the next, both the grade level before it and the grade level following it. So the big idea in math is always that we start with basic concepts, and everything that extends beyond that is just another expansion of something that already made sense. Okay, so if you look at how this works out, you see kind of the focus level here. The K through 5 standards maintain a focus on arithmetic, so this calculation procedures, providing a solid foundation for later mathematical studies and expect students to know single-digit sums and products from memory, not memorization. Now, many students see this and then do not understand what is the difference. And hopefully by the end of this class, you will definitely know that. By memory, memory just means recall. Okay. Now, why can we recall something? It's not necessarily because we memorized it. Sometimes it can be because we actually have learned the process of how things work. So the solution becomes not something I've memorized, but just a compilation of strategies I've learned how to use to work with that particular content. Okay, 6 through 8, foundation of everyday math, connection between earlier work and arithmetic, and the focus of abstract work, which is where we're going into the high school. Okay, of course, the high school standards will be complex and based on conceptual strategies with special emphasis on modeling. Modeling does not mean building a physical model of an object. So we think of modeling, we think of like, building a model airplane or something along those lines. It's not that type of modeling. Modeling here is going to be how we can show or represent a pattern in mathematics. We can do that with things like equations. We can actually build physical models, but it's not specifically what that's asking for here. Okay. Now, how do we read the standards? Standards have several parts to them. Every time you see an individual standard, it's going to be part of a domain. Okay, domains are big groups. They are sort of like very large idea type separations. Okay, clusters then are going to relate similar standards within the domain. Standards from different clusters may also be related. That's just the nature of math. The actual standard itself, which tells us what the student should be able to do. Okay. And then the standards for math practice, which we'll be discussing later. Okay. Remember the standards for content. This is what we're looking at here in the Kentucky Revised Academic Standards. Most of us are focusing on the content standard. That is the actual skill or knowledge that the student is expected to do in that grade level. Okay. The standards for math practice are something that's completely different. Standards for math practice involve the ways students engage in math thinking. So we expect the content standards to be different by grade level. However, the standards for math practice should be the same in every single grade level. No matter what we're learning, these are the methods and the strategies and the thinking practices we're going to use to learn that. Okay, so if I zoom in on this just a little bit, I have an example here of all of these parts. Okay, so counting and cardinality, that is the domain here. It's the big idea. This cluster is about counting to tell the number of objects. This is about counting. And then these standards are the individual skills or processes about counting that we want our students to be able to do. Now, this is a math practice, okay, one of the 8 math practices, which again we'll talk about later, that could be happening, okay, within this standard. Most of the time, it very clearly is happening within this standard, no matter what, but sometimes it will depend upon how the classroom is set up and the practice of teaching that whether or not that math practice is actually being demonstrated or not. Okay. So how do we read these? Okay, in grades K through 8, we see KY because this is a Kentucky academic standard. The first number is going to tell us grade level. G is the domain. Okay, you can see a list of domains later on. And then, of course, 3 is the individual standard. Once we get into high school, now you notice that there will be labeled with grades up until the 8th grade. Once you get into high school, they're sort of all thrown in together, and then it's up to the core classes at the high school level to differentiate between who's going to be responsible for what standard. So we have Kentucky high school. F is the conceptual category here, and the standard is 5. So if we are to scroll down, and those are just the listing of the 8 math practices that is directly involved in here. Again, we'll be talking about those later. But here are our first page of standards, and this starts with kindergarten. okay? And this is an overview. So it tells us the domains in kindergarten are going to be counting and cardinality, operations and algebraic thinking, numbers and operations in base 10, measurement and data and geometry, okay? And this is kind of overall, what do we want them to know and be able to do throughout kindergarten, okay? And here we see a little bit more of a summary and specific things. And then we get into the actual breakdown. Domain, here's the cluster, here's the actual standard. This is standard number 1. It has parts A and B. Over here on the right, we see a clarification. So sometimes when we read a standard, it's real easy to think, well, what do you mean by that? Over here should give us some examples. And again, the math practices that could technically be used here, we see them represented with their numbers, and we see some description of that down here as well. Now, if we go on up to high school, okay, and that's quite a ways down the road here. Here I know I'm in first grade, Kentucky 1, that's first grade, okay? So I'm definitely have a long way to travel. So I'm going to go ahead and pull my bar down and see how much closer I am now. Okay. So I'm in high school standards here. I know that because I see high school. I'm going to go try to go up to the beginning and find the high school overview. Okay, well, here we've broken down into algebra, conceptual category. Okay, so we have several conceptual categories when it comes to working with our high school standards. So instead of grades in high school, we're going to see that conceptual category that's going to help us differentiate the standards. So here's number and quantity. Okay, so overall, kind of what we're looking at that. And each one of those conceptual categories will have its own overview. Of course, we have geometry when we're working with the high school levels as well. Here we have the number system. This is an 8th grade overview. So we have actually left high school now. And as you can see, this way a standard is labeled lets us know exactly it's coming from Kentucky Standards. It's focusing on the 8th grade. I would bet this comes from functions, but again, you'd have to look at that cluster or that, the domain. That would be the domain. And then this is the first standard. Okay, so this standard says understand a function is a rule that assigns to each input exactly one output. The graph of a function is a set of ordered pairs consisting of an input and the corresponding output. So that's the standard clarifications. Okay, so further things we might add to help the teacher or whoever's deciding this understand how to teach this to a group of students. Okay, so reading our standards there, excellent. Now, what are the standards for math practice? So I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning. We differentiated between the two when we first brought this up, between a content standard and a standard for mathematical practice. Again, content standards are going to be specific about what math that the student is going to learn how to do in that grade level or in that content band for the high school. Standards for math practices, again, these are not about content. I can do standards of math practice, several of them, sometimes even possible, within any kind of individual or single content that we teach. These are things that should be happening in your classroom, no matter what grade you're teaching, no matter what content they're learning about. These are the type of practices that if students partake in these, then they're going to be more likely to have an effective mathematics learning experience. So what are these things we want students to do? Make sense of problems and persevere in solving them. Okay? Reason abstractly and quantitatively. Construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others. Model with mathematics. Use appropriate tools strategically. Okay? That might include technology. Attend precision. Look for and make use of repeated structure. And look for and express regularity in repeated reasoning. Okay, so those are our standards for math practice. You might want to take some time, visit this webpage yourself, and read through those if this is the first time you've been introduced to them. Many people find them very similar to process types of standards from the NCTM group, but we'll also look at those individually as well. So take a few moments, find the Kentucky Academic Standards document. If you find that you're going to use it a lot, as I do, I often go ahead and save the PDF to my computer so that I can access it very easily. This link to the standards will also be posted in the course up in the very introductory module.